and welcome to the Debate Basics. Today we're going to be talking about World's Debate. World's Debate is an international format that didn't originate in the US and is a combination of British parliamentary debate and Australian Asian debate formats. Before I get started, one thing to keep in mind is that if nothing I'm saying is just making any sense whatsoever and you just don't get what's going on, check out the videos in the description below. I have linked some great debates in this format that'll help you visualize and conceptualize exactly what I'm talking about, so maybe you'll understand it a little bit better. That being said, let's get to the basics. World's Debate is a 3v3 debate format where the primary goal is to convince the judge that your side is right, or at least better than the other side. Makes sense, right? There are two sides, side opposition and side proposition. Make sure for you US debaters out there not to use words like affirmative or negative. World's Debate is very much an emulation of parliamentary procedures, so respect the format. Also don't use words like perm, counterplan, etc., words that you would have only learned in policy or LD debate. And while I said that World's Debate is a 3v3 format, up to 5 people can be on a team. To clarify, 1 or 2 people would sit out, depending on whether or not you have a 4 or 5 person team, in a situation where you have more than 3 people. The reason why this can be helpful is, as you'll see later and when I talk about impromptu debates, is that having 5 people can help with creating arguments or constructing cases, and also deciding who simply debates in the round itself based on who's most well versed in the topic. So, to simplify, 3 people debate in a round, but 1 or 2 people can also be there just to help create arguments in general. Motions are what topics are called in World's Debate, and they generally follow the format like this house would, this house supports, this house believes, etc. This house is like an abstract body, generally something that doesn't need to be defined, although the proposition may do so if they see fit. If it's not defined, it's generally assumed to be like side proposition. Now, on to speech times. There are 4 speeches for each side, 8 in total. There's the Prop 1, Op 1, Prop 2, Op 2, Prop 3, Op 3, Op Reply, and Prop Reply in that order. The first 6 speeches of the debate, so anything not labeled a reply, are 8 minutes long. The 2 reply speeches at the end of the debate are 4 minutes long. The reply speech can only be given by the first 4 speakers of the debate, so essentially not the third speaker of both sides. So the Prop 3 and the Op 3 cannot give the reply. Alright, so you know the speech names now, but what do they do? And before I go into this, I'd like to have a quick disclaimer. What I'm explaining are the basics of what I have learned. They're the general way that you can construct a speech and be persuasive to the judge. That being said, they are available to be changed based on what you or your team or your coach perceives as the best way to deliver said speech. So don't necessarily take what I'm saying as the ultimate word of what these speeches have to be, but the general goal of what I'm saying is generally what you're supposed to do in each speech. The first prop speaker is fairly common sense. They have 8 minutes to create a case for their team. Generally, there are 3 arguments for each side. The first 2 of proposition will be given in this speech. The third one will generally be given in the Prop 2 or the second speech for side proposition. Now, by the way, arguments in this format are called substantives and not contentions. Now, the first speaker is the first glimpse a judge gets of your team, so make sure they sound confident and know their stuff. They also need to know how to handle questions well, so that they don't mess up future speakers or arguments by answering a question incorrectly or poorly. Keep in mind, what the first speaker says in this speech will stick with your team for the rest of the debate. The first opposition speaker is a little bit different from the first proposition speaker. Not only do they need to set up their first 2 arguments, once again the third of which will be delivered by the second opposition speaker, they also need to respond to the first proposition case presented in the previous speech. Time allocation needs to be great for this speech because they need to spend the first 4 minutes of their speech quickly responding to their opponent's case as well as answering questions, and spend the next 4 minutes making their own case and building their own case up. Once again, the first 2 arguments. Now, I know you might be wondering how questions work in this format, but I'll explain them after the speeches. Really quick, a good goal to shoot for though is to do a 3-5 split where you spend 3 minutes on the opponent's case and 5 minutes setting up your own case, but 4-4 is a little bit easier to achieve, so for now, just aim for that goal. The second proposition has a similar speech to the first opposition, in the sense that they need to respond to their opponent's arguments, then set up their arguments. However, the second speaker for proposition luckily only set up one argument, meaning they can spend more time responding to their opponent's case and responding to what their opponent said on their case. They need about 2 minutes to set up their final argument. The second opposition is the same as the second proposition. Nothing too fancy. One thing I will say, though, is that there were other ways to do this speech. A common way being asking 2 fundamental questions of the debate, then setting up your third argument. However, I think personally for me, or at least for beginners, it's easier to do the format that I'm describing. I'm just giving this quick disclaimer in case your coach or someone else who's directing you on how to give these speeches tells you something different than what I'm telling you. It's just so that you know that this format can be viable. Alright, now for the third speech. Both sides use the same format. It's your job to change the way the debate has looked so far, but not by adding new arguments, but simply by shifting the way speeches have been given. Generally, you use a 3-question format where you talk about the 3 fundamental questions of today's round. An example would be, in a debate about community, simply, which side best aids the people? You want to shift the arguments in this round and make them more offensive. You don't want to go line by line at all. Yes, discuss your opponent's points, but discuss them in a general sense. However, on opposition, make sure to discuss your 3 questions with your reply speaker. They're going to be going right after you, and they need to know what you're saying so they don't overlap too much and sound repetitive, because a judge isn't going to want to listen to the same exact speech, and it's also going to do nothing for you if the 2 speeches talk about the same material. That being said, let's go to the reply. Once again, for the reply, both sides will use the same format, or at least have a similar goal in mind. Remember that the op reply comes right after the op third, so let's just talk about the reply as if we're the op reply. So there's 2 formats that you can do. One is the 2 worlds format, and the other is the 3 questions format. In the 2 worlds format, you present your world and compare it to that of the proposition world, and explain why your world is better on a multitude of issues. Or you could do the more common version, I'll say it's more common. Of the 3 fundamental questions. And this speech will be given similar to how you gave or at least your third speaker gave their speech. Like stated earlier, if you do 3 questions on op, make sure you don't use the same ones as your third speaker so it's not repetitive and you're not just wasting the speech. One strategy to do is if that the third speaker used all of your questions, just use the 2 worlds format. That way, at least it sounds like a different format, and the judge isn't hearing the same exact thing over again. And they might perceive it as a different argument just because it's in a different version. The prop reply, like I said, follows the same format, but they don't have to worry about sounding repetitive like the third and fourth reply, or the third and fourth speakers of their opposition do, just because there are 2 speeches in between their third speaker and themselves. However, one thing the prop reply must be wary of that the op reply doesn't have to be wary of is that they need to be careful of new arguments in the third opposition. Now, I know I just said that the third speakers cannot create new arguments, but I didn't contradict myself here. What I mean is, the third speaker may not present entirely new arguments, but instead be kind of sneaky in the way that they present new arguments, i.e. making them sound like they've been given in earlier speeches, even if they necessarily haven't. The third speaker can do this by referencing, remember what my second speaker told you, or things like that, because the judges in a worlds debate aren't going to be writing down or flowing very heavily as to what arguments have been given in the round. That means the third opposition speaker can kind of be sneaky in terms of getting arguments in there the proposition reply would have to respond to that they wouldn't necessarily have the foundation to respond to based on the previous speeches. Should this happen, the prop reply can simply quickly respond to them at the top, at the beginning of their speech before going into their fundamental questions or their 2 worlds analysis, or incorporate responses while they're doing the 2 worlds analysis or fundamental questions. Make sure to say, though, these are new arguments. Like, the third speaker just made something up if they just completely brought in a new argument. But also make sure to give those responses. That way, even if the judge doesn't buy that they are new arguments, you have responses in there. So let me do some quick tips before I go into points of information or the way questions work in Worlds Debate. 1. Intros in this format are important, even if it's only for a few seconds. These speeches must be persuasive, and it sounds better to include things like intros for emotional appeal or to aid one's strategy. A common thing included in intros are team lines. These are short, catchy phrases every person should say at the beginning of their speech. An example Team USA likes is, "It is because we believe in justice, not just us, that we proudly oppose." 2. Try to reach your full time of 8 minutes. I know it can be hard to talk that long, but trust me, it looks pretty bad to a judge if you finish early. Finishing a few seconds early, maybe up to like 15, isn't horrible, but it's still best to reach the full time. On the flip side, you should try and end your speech at about 15 seconds overtime if you go over time. That is considered a grace period, but after that the judge may start banging on the table to signal that you need to end. 3. A common courtesy in this format dictates that at the start and end of every speech, it is nice to slap the table. It sounds weird, but clapping isn't really a thing in this format. That can also be used if someone on your side asks an amazing question or says something very persuasive or really nice. Use the banging for that table for those things sparingly. It can be considered rude to bang the table every time your teammate says something even remotely nice. 4. This debate is an international format, which means you need international examples. Staying in US examples or ideology for Worlds Debate is a no-no. For example, don't talk about US democracy the whole debate. US democracy is very, very rare, which means you should look towards more international forms of democracy, like parliaments. 5. I have said this before, but as a reminder, stay away from heavy US format jargon. Use world-specific jargon. An example is the phrase, "take my opponents at their highest ground." This essentially means, assume the opponent's argument is true. This can be used to show why even if your opponent wins one facet of argumentation, they still lose the whole debate as a whole. Now on to points of information. Points of information are questions or even statements that the opponent asked during your speech or that you asked during theirs to try and point out strategic errors or argument flaws. These can only be used during the first 6 speeches of the round, so not during replies. Members of the non-speaking team must signal that they wish to be recognized by raising their hand or something else, and generally a person will stand up with their hand up and say something like "ma'am," "sir," "point of information," etc. Then it is up to the speaker whether or not to allow a point of information. If the speaker does not wish to take a point of information at this point in the debate, they can wave the speaker down, as shown in the videos. As is customary, POI should take no longer than about 15 seconds, and the speaker should allow at least 2 POIs during their speech. The first and last minutes of each main speech are protected, and POIs are not allowed during those opening and closing minutes. Do not ever take more than 3 POIs in a speech. 2 is recommended. Taking less than 2 looks like the speaker is scared and does not know their case well enough to respond to POIs. Take 3 or more, and that makes the speaker look like they don't know their case and cannot fill up their entire speech time. Alright, now the basics of the format are done. Let's talk about how the rounds themselves work. There are 2 types of rounds. There's prepared motions and impromptu motions. Prepared motions are given to you before the tournament, and it is your job and your team's job to create cases for both sides of the debate before coming to the tournament itself. You should generally write out your substantives, write out your intros, team lines. You should also write out things like your POIs or responses to arguments you predict your opponent will make. Clearly, you're not going to necessarily use all of these POIs or responses, but if you correctly predict your opponent's case, you have something pre-prepared that you can use to respond to their case. In terms of evidence, it isn't as important as other US formats, but you should have some evidence in there. You can have like a quick quote, some quick statistic, but it's not as important, I would say, in terms of helping you win the round. A judge will never vote off a piece of evidence, unless like your opponent had one piece of evidence that created the entire crux of their case, and you just had a better piece of evidence on that subject. You should know things like recency and author, but you're most likely not going to be asked about those kinds of things, but just know it just in case someone does decide to ask you. But once again, it's not really that important. Just don't use some fake source. Make sure you know like the source is credible and that what you're stating isn't like false, because if your opponent knows it's false, then that'll look really bad if they point that out. Now, like I said, your evidence is never going to win you a debate, but it's good to have. In terms of other things for prepared motions, just make sure your entire team is like understanding what the substantives are so that you don't find out in the middle of the round that one person just has no idea what's going on. So make sure to review the case with your team, figure out what substantives you want, talk it out, make sure the arguments make sense, make sure your first and second speaker on that topic are prepped and ready to go upon arriving to that round. And make sure your responses and POIs that you have pre-prepared for your opponent's case also make sense. That way, you can like quickly write them out on some cards or print them out and have them on your table, ready to use when your opponent brings up an argument that you have responses for. Now, the other type of format are called impromptu rounds. In impromptu rounds, you and your team are given 1 hour to prepare a topic that the tournament gives you before the round starts. So you can only bring in an almanac and in a dictionary. You're not allowed to use things like the internet or your phone. And the main thing you have to do is get through that hour by figuring out your 3 substantives, getting a case ready to go, potentially writing out some POIs and responses. Essentially something you do for a prepared motion, but maybe a little less detailed as you're relying on the knowledge that you know. It's important to include international examples. However, if you only know US examples, well, then that's what you're stuck with. But generally, it's a good idea to read a lot for Worlds Debate, because when it does come to impromptu rounds, you're gonna want to include international examples. And if you don't know any, it might look perceptually bad if your opponent just lists like 50 international examples about the topic and you have none. That being said, it's understandable that once again, starting out this format, you're not going to know every single example. I myself don't know a lot of like international examples for specific topics, and I know I have a lot of reading to do. That's just a good idea to know going into this format that you should probably be doing a little bit of reading for like current event topics, because those are generally what are considered for impromptu rounds. Remember how at the beginning of this video I told you sometimes it's beneficial to have 5 members. That's helpful for impromptu rounds. If 3 members of your team don't necessarily know a lot about a topic, but the other 2 do, that's great in terms of constructing arguments and figuring out who goes in the round, which is generally why 5 members can be helpful, just because they might have specialties in different areas of the format. Before this video ends, I will talk a little bit more about the technical aspects of Worlds Debate. These are tips on how to structure or add things to the top of your speeches before one goes into the arguments. Both sides have the ability to create framework and burdens. What I mean by that is both sides are able to explain after their intro as to what they think the fundamental debates should be revolved around. You say that we need to focus in this round, as well as set burdens for the other side. For example, the opposition must prove that the world of the proposition is more harmful for oppressed individuals than the status quo. You can also put burdens on yourself. For example, the only thing proposition needs to do in this round is to prove that the world of proposition is more moral than the status quo. Framework in Worlds Debate is a guide for the judge. You cannot, and I'll repeat that for the US debaters out there, you cannot win or lose because of framework. Framework in Worlds Debate functions as another benefit to your side, but not an explicit reason your side should win. The other quick thing is models. Models are like plans. To put it simply, they are the way proposition feels the motion would be carried out if implemented into a policy. They can be vague or specific depending on the motion. If the debate is focused on how effective the motion is, having a specific model can be beneficial to make sure the other side can't attack your model. Generally, debate should never focus on the model. Models, though, cannot be abusive, i.e., they must be general enough to allow both sides to have some ground in the debate. An example of a model is as follows on the motion, this House would institute a robot tax. We would levy a robot tax on companies who use AI, as described in the definition. However, smaller businesses would be subject to a significantly lesser tax, similar as to how the upper class is taxed more than the lower class in society. Second, money from the tax is recycled into social development, i.e. programs like welfare or public schools. So those are the specifics of the models, as well as generally what framework should be. These happen in the first proposition and first opposition speech and should sort of be discussed later in the debate, but the debate should never revolve around these issues. Okay, I think I went through everything. If you have any lingering questions, be sure to ask me in the comments, and I hope this helped. As a reminder, check out the videos in the description below for some great examples of world's debate, and I'll see you next time.